The widower's twins hid the bride's trunk under the porch, so she couldn't leave them. The trunk was gone. I know because I was the one who went to fetch it for her, first morning after she arrived, when she said she needed her second dress and the coat with the wool collar. I pulled up the latch on the buckboard where I'd set it the night before, and the bed was empty. Nothing but a coil of old rope and a rusted pry bar that had been there since before Martha died. I stood in the yard a moment with the cold coming off the ground and looked at the house. Smoke already out of the chimney. She'd been up before me, which I hadn't expected. I walked the perimeter of the buckboard, looked under it, then I looked at the porch. You couldn't see under there unless you got down on your knees, which I did, and there it was, her brown trunk shoved back hard against the foundation stones, mud on both sides of it where it had been dragged through the yard in the dark. 2 sets of small boot prints in the soft dirt beside the steps, going in, going out, going in again. The boys were 8 years old, Cal and Denny, identical in every way that didn't matter and different in every way that did. I sat back on my heels in the cold and looked at those boot prints for a long time. She hadn't come out yet. I could hear the stove through the thin wall, the sound of a pan being set down. She'd found the kitchen. I didn't know what I was going to say to her about the trunk, about the boys, about any of it. I'd written 2 letters in 6 months, and she'd written 3 back, and then she'd stepped off the stage in Millhaven with that brown trunk and a carpet bag, and looked at me the way a person looks at a thing they bought without seeing it first. Measuring. Not unkind, but measuring. Her name was Adeline Prout. She was 31, widow herself, out of Missouri, no children. The letter from the agency had said she was experienced at ranch work and had no illusions about frontier life, which turned out to be true in ways the agency probably hadn't meant. I went inside. She was at the stove in her traveling dress, the only dress she had accessible since her trunk was in the mud under my porch, and she'd found the cornmeal and the salt pork and was making something that smelled better than anything that had come out of that kitchen in 18 months. The boys were at the table already, watching her the way cats watch a bird through glass, quiet and intense and fully occupied. I said, "Miss Prout." She said, "Mr. Cade," without turning around. I said, "I need to tell you something about your trunk." She was quiet for a moment, then she said, "I know where my trunk is." I waited. "I heard them," she said, "round about 2 in the morning. Didn't take much to put it together when I looked out the window." She turned then, with the wooden spoon in her hand, and looked at me. She had brown eyes and a steady way of looking that I'd noticed when she got off the stage. "Question is what you're going to do about it." Cal and Denny were frozen at the table. Denny had a piece of cornbread halfway to his mouth that he didn't seem to remember was there. I looked at them. I said, "Get it out." Neither of them moved. I said, "Right now. Get the trunk out from under the porch, brush the mud off it the best you can, and bring it inside. Then you're going to stand in front of Miss Prout, and you're going to tell her what you did and why." Denny put the cornbread down. They looked at each other with that twin look, the one that carries a whole conversation in about half a second, and then they pushed back from the table and went out. Adeline turned back to the stove. I said, "I'm sorry." She said, "Don't be sorry for them. They're children doing what children do when they're scared." She scraped the pan. "Be sorry if it happens again." That was the first morning. I should back up and tell you how it was before she came, because the before matters. Martha died in the spring of '81, middle of a calving season, the kind of thing that feels like a joke God tells when he's run out of patience. Fever that came on quick and didn't leave. 3 days and she was gone, and I was standing in a yard full of half-born cattle with 2 7-year-old boys looking up at me, and a house that still smelled like her bread. I'm not a man given to explaining himself. I'll say that the year after was bad and leave it there. The boys needed their father present, and their father was sometimes not fully present. I held the ranch together because the ranch was something I knew how to do. Hold a bottle of whiskey without opening it, that took more effort, and I didn't always succeed. I kept the boys fed and clothed and in school when school was in session, and I made sure the animals had water and the fences held, and the bills got paid mostly on time. Everything else went to pieces quietly. Cal and Denny, being 8-year-old boys, had decided by the second winter that what the house needed was not a new mother. They were clear on that, crystal clear, made their position known in language that would have gotten them the back of Martha's hand, but something in between. They wanted the house to feel like something again. They wanted biscuits that weren't rocks. They wanted someone to check their arithmetic. They wanted the lamp lit in the evening. What they did not want was someone to take their mother's place. They had appointed themselves guardians of Martha's memory with the ferocity that only children can manage, and any woman who walked through that door was going to find out about it fast. I knew this when I wrote the letter to the agency. I wrote it in January of '83, sat at the table for about an hour first doing nothing, then wrote it in maybe 12 minutes without stopping because if I stopped I wouldn't finish. I told them I had a working ranch, 1,200 acres, a sound house, 2 boys of 8 who had been without a mother for nearly 2 years. I said I was 44 and healthy and not a drinking man, which was more aspiration than truth at that point, but I made it true afterward. I said I was looking for a woman of practical nature, not afraid of work, who understood what she was coming to. The agency sent me Adeline Prout's letter. She had written it herself, no intermediary, 3 pages in a clear hand. She told me about her first husband, who had died of a lung sickness outside of St. Joseph, and the farm they'd had that she'd had to sell to cover his debts. She said she had managed livestock, kept accounts, put up preserves, sown what needed sowing, and was not afraid of cold weather or hard seasons. She said she had wanted children but had not had them, and at 31 understood she was not going to have them the ordinary way. She said she did not expect romance. She expected a partnership, and she was willing to work for the latter if the former turned out to be a surprise. That last line, I read it 4 or 5 times. I wrote back, she wrote back, I wrote again. The third letter I almost didn't send because it had gotten longer than I intended and said things I hadn't meant to write down about the boys, about what it had been like, about what I was trying to build back into a life. I sent it anyway because by then I figured she either was what she said she was or she wasn't, and if she wasn't, better to know it before she got on the stage. She wrote back a single page. She said, "I'll come in March." She came in March. The boys dragged the trunk in. They'd done a reasonable job on the mud, which told me they'd gone out to the barn for a rag before they came back inside, which meant they'd had time to arrange their story. They set it just inside the door. Denny's boot was untied and he didn't fix it, which meant he was hoping to get this done fast. Adeline had served the breakfast. She sat down at the table across from where the boys were standing, and she looked at them without any particular expression. Cal said, "We hid your trunk." She said, "I know." He said, "We didn't want you to have your things so you couldn't leave." She said, "I know that too." Denny said, "Our ma's trunk is in the attic." There was a silence. I was standing near the door and I didn't say anything. Adeline looked at Denny for a moment and then she said, "I'm not here for your mother's trunk. I have my own." Denny said, "You're not going to move her things." Adeline said, "I don't know what's in your attic, that's yours. I'm not here to change what was. I'm here because your father needed someone and because I needed somewhere to be. That's the plain truth of it." Cal looked at her sideways. He was the harder one, Cal. Denny was the one who said the thing out loud. Cal was the one who'd thought of it first. Cal said, "What if we don't want you here?" Adeline picked up her fork. "Eat your breakfast," she said. "We'll figure the rest out." That first week she did not try to win them. That was the thing I noticed. Most women, I don't know how I know this, just that I do, most women in her position would have tried something. Brought them a sweet from her bag. made a fuss over something they'd made or said, tried to find the angle in. Adeline didn't do any of that. She cooked and she cleaned and she went out to the yard and looked over the fencing situation with the same appraising look she'd had when she got off the stage. And she fixed the latch on the chicken coop that I'd been meaning to fix since November. I found her out there with a hammer she'd gotten from the barn, crouched in the cold mud, replacing a board. I said, I was going to do that. She said, board doesn't know that. I watched her for a minute. She did it right, measured the board first, 2 nails, not one at each end. When she stood, she had mud on both knees and didn't seem to care. I said, Cal and Denny give you any more trouble this morning? She said, Cal watched me make the biscuits like he was waiting for me to fail. When they came out right, he went outside. Denny asked me if I knew how to make molasses cookies. I said, Martha used to make them. She said, I know, he told me. She brushed her hands together. I told him I'd need him to show me her recipe. I didn't say anything to that. She picked up the hammer and walked back toward the barn, and I stood there in the mud looking at the fixed latch. There was a hen that had gotten out and was scratching around near the buckboard. She'd have fixed that too, given another 5 minutes. I put the hen back myself and stood in the yard for a moment and thought about whether I'd made the right decision, sending that letter. Then I thought that the decision had already been made, and the only question now was what I did with it, which was usually how decisions worked for me. By the end of the first week, I understood that the partnership she'd mentioned in her letter was not a word she used loosely. She went through the account books with me, sitting at the kitchen table in the evening after the boys were in bed, and she didn't flinch at the numbers, which had been ugly for a while. She asked questions that were good questions, about the cattle count, about what we'd sold last fall, about whether we had a contract with the buyer in Millhaven or just a handshake. When I said handshake, she said, we should get that in writing before summer. I said, he's been reliable. She said, reliable men die and leave unreliable heirs. I thought about that. I said, you've run accounts before. She said, my husband was sick for 2 years before he died. I ran everything. She wasn't complaining. She was just telling me the shape of who she was. I filed it away. The second week she reorganized the dry goods shelf in the pantry, which didn't sound like much, but Martha had had her way of arranging it, and I'd kept it the same way because it was the same way, and I came in and saw it different and felt something sharp for a moment. Then I looked at it again. It made more sense her way. Things you used most toward the front, things that kept longest toward the back. I stood there for a minute, and then I closed the pantry door and didn't say anything about it. That night I went out to the barn and sat with the horses for a while, the way I used to do when I needed quiet that the house didn't have. The bay mare put her nose against my shoulder. I sat on the hay bale in the dark and thought about Martha, which I hadn't let myself do properly in a while. Not the death, just her. The particular way she moved when she was irritated, fast and decisive. The sound of her voice reading to the boys. The fact that she had always, from the first year on, known what I was thinking before I said it, which was both a comfort and, occasionally, inconvenient. I thought about how she would have assessed Adeline Prout. Quick, I thought. She would have been quick about it and accurate. She had that in her, the ability to see people whole in the first 5 minutes. She'd done it with me when we met, and she'd been right, which I was still, 20 years later, a little unsettled by. I sat there until the cold got into my boots, and then I went back inside. The trouble with Denny came in the second week, and it wasn't meanness. It was the other thing, attachment, coming on too fast. He'd asked her for the molasses cookie recipe on a Sunday, and she'd sat with him in the kitchen for an hour while they went through it together, him with Martha's little card in his hand reading it out and her converting the amounts, the two of them going back and forth. I wasn't in the room for most of it. When I came in for coffee, they were taking the first batch out of the oven, and Denny was standing on the chair beside her so he could see, and he had her by the sleeve without seeming to know he was doing it. I made myself look away. That night he cried in his room, which he hadn't done in a while. I went in. He said he didn't know why he was crying. I said that was all right, you didn't always have to know. He said, I don't want to like her. I said, I know. He said, because if I like her and she leaves. I said, she's not going to leave. He said, you can't know that. And he was right, I couldn't. I sat on the edge of his bed in the dark with my hand on his shoulder and I didn't say anything else. After a while his breathing evened out and I went back downstairs. Adeline was still up, reading at the table. She looked at me when I came down. I shook my head a little. She looked back at her book. That was the end of that, but I carried the weight of it. She went to town with me the following Friday to get supplies. I'd been going to town alone since Martha died. It felt strange to have someone on the bench beside me on the wagon, the warmth of another person, the small sounds of another person moving. We didn't talk much on the way in. She looked at the country coming out of the hills and asked once about the creek line and whether it held water in July, and I told her sometimes yes and sometimes no depending on the year. She asked about the neighbors to the south, the Garner family, and I told her what I knew, which wasn't much. The Garners kept to themselves. She said that was probably wise given what I described about their property lines. In town, Harlan Webb saw us coming down the main street. Webb had the hardware and thought he ran the town, which he mostly did. He was standing outside his store with two other men, and he watched us pull up with an expression I'd seen him use on other things, appraising, a little amused. He said, Cade, this the woman from the agency. I said, this is my wife, Adeline. We hadn't actually married yet. We'd agreed to wait a month, give both of us a clear look at what we were getting into. But something about the way Webb said it made me say it that way, and I didn't regret it. Adeline didn't react to it, didn't correct me, just nodded at Webb with exactly the composure she seemed to have been born with. Webb said, bit old for a mail order, isn't she? Adeline said, I could say the same thing about him, and yet here we both are, so I suppose old just means experienced. The two men with Webb laughed. Webb didn't. I helped her down from the wagon. She took my hand like she'd been taking it for years and walked with me into the mercantile without looking back at him. Inside, the woman who ran the mercantile, a Mrs. Fry who had known Martha, gave Adeline a particular kind of look. Not hostile, just assessing. Adeline gave her the same look back. They were probably the two most efficient assessors I'd ever met, and it was a small room for it, but they reached some kind of agreement without saying anything that I was aware of, and Mrs. Fry began filling the order. On the way home, Adeline said she was Martha's friend. I said, for years. She said, she'll watch me for a while. I said, most of them will. She said, that's fair. She looked at the road. I'd watch too in her place. We drove for a while in quiet. The road out of Millhaven ran alongside the creek for a mile before it cut south toward the hills, and the willows along the bank were just coming into leaf, that pale yellow-green that doesn't last. She was looking at them. She said, how long have you had the ranch? I said, 19 years. Came out in '64 with $600, 2 mules, and more confidence than sense. She said, what happened to the mules? I said, one died, sold the other for seed money. I thought about it. Best financial decision I ever made. That mule was mean. She laughed a little at that. First time I'd heard her laugh. It was a real one, not a polite one. I said, what about you, before St. Joseph? She said, Ohio, then Indiana, then Missouri. My father moved toward work. He was a good man but restless. She paused. I got the practical part from him. The staying part I came to on my own. I thought about that for the rest of the drive. In the second week, something happened that I've thought about since. Not because it was dramatic, but because it wasn't. I had a roan gelding, 7 years old, good animal, that had been colicking on and off since December. The vet in Millhaven had been out twice and said what vets say when they don't know the answer, which was to walk him and watch him and not panic. I'd been walking him in the evenings and watching him and not panicking mostly. That particular evening I came in late and tired and went to check on him and found Adeline already in the barn, walking him herself, slow circles in the lamplight. She had her coat on over her nightgown. Her boots were unlaced. I said, "How long have you been out here?" She said, "About an hour. He was in distress. You were at the south fence." I said, "You could have come for me." She said, "He didn't need you. He needed someone walking him." She made the turn at the end of the stall. The roan moved with her, resigned but steady. "He's easier now." I watched them for a minute. She walked like someone who'd done this before, not tentative, not making a production of it, just walking. I said, "You know colic." She said, "Lost a horse to it on our farm, didn't walk him long enough." She looked at the roan. I wasn't going to let that happen again. I took over the walking after that and she went back inside. But I thought about it while I walked him, the unlaced boots, the fact that she'd been watching the animals close enough to notice, the fact that she hadn't come to get me but had just handled it. She could have let me deal with it when I came in. It was my horse. She didn't. The roan got better. I don't know if it was because of her that night or not, but he got better. There was a night in the third week when I couldn't sleep. This happened sometimes. I'd lie in bed and the quiet of the house would pile up on me and I'd end up in the kitchen with the lamp low, just sitting. I was doing that when I heard her door. She came out in her robe, her hair down, and she stopped when she saw me and said, "Can't sleep either." I said no. She got 2 cups and poured from the pot I'd left on the stove, cold coffee, but she didn't seem to care and sat down across from me. Not close, just across the table. The lamp was between us. I said, "Do you miss Missouri?" She said, "I miss certain things, the way the summer smelled there, a friend I had." She turned the cup in her hands. "I don't miss the particular feeling of being the woman who's managing alone and pretending she isn't." I said, "What did that feel like?" She said, "Like holding a wall up with your back. You get used to leaning." She looked at me. "You know what that's like?" I said, "Maybe." She said, "Not maybe." I looked at the lamp. A moth was trying to get to it, hitting the glass over and over with the patience of something that can't learn from its mistakes. I said, "The boys are coming around." She said, "Denny is. Cal is watching." I said, "That's just Cal." She said, "I know, he's like you." I looked at her. She said, "You watch before you move, both of you. It's not a fault." The lamp put a shadow up the wall and I could see the line of her jaw and the way her hair came down over one shoulder. She was not what I'd pictured when I wrote that first letter. What I'd pictured was something more like a figure, a category of woman, competent and plain and easy to be around. What she was specific, particular, the kind of particular you can't plan for. I said, "The letter you sent, the last one, you said you didn't expect romance but that it might turn out to be a surprise." She said, "I remember." I said, "What did you mean by that?" She was quiet for a moment. I meant that I'd stopped believing in it and then decided not to stop. You can decide that, it's a decision. She looked at me across the lamp. "Why? Are you asking for a reason?" I didn't have an answer to that. She nodded like that was an answer anyway, and got up and rinsed her cup and went back to her room. I sat there for another hour with the cold coffee and the moth hitting the glass, and thought about a woman who had decided not to stop believing in things. I had stopped, somewhere in those 18 months. I hadn't noticed until just then. The wedding was on the first Friday of April, in the parlor of the Millhaven preacher with the boys as witnesses. Cal wore the collar that was a little too tight and didn't complain about it. Denny had picked a handful of early wildflowers from the creek bank and given them to Adeline before we went inside, pushed them into her hand without saying anything. She had put them in her lapel. The preacher said what preachers say and we said what needed to be said back, and that was that. There was no party. We drove home and she made supper and the boys did their schoolwork at the table, and I went out to the barn to check on a heifer that had been off her feed for 2 days. When I came back in, Adeline was sitting in the chair by the lamp mending something of Denny's. He was hard on his sleeves, and the boys had gone to bed. I hung up my coat. She said without looking up, "How's the heifer?" I said, "She'll be all right. Got into something, I think. She'll work it out." She said, "Good." I stood in the middle of the room for a moment. She looked up then. I said, "This is a strange day to just end." She said, "All days end the same," but she was almost smiling. I pulled the other chair up closer to hers, not touching, just closer, and I sat down. She went back to the mending. I picked up the almanac off the side table and looked at it without reading it. The lamp was warm and the fire was down to coals, and outside the wind was doing the thing it does in April, not cold, not warm, just moving. We sat like that for a while. It was the most peaceful I'd felt in 2 years. I turned a page of the almanac I hadn't read. She snipped a thread and started the next seam. Neither of us said anything, and neither of us needed to. Summer came hard. The cattle work doubled in June, and I was up before light most mornings and in until after dark. Adeline ran the house and the kitchen garden and the accounts, and did it without flagging. She'd hired a girl from town twice a week, a Mexican girl named Petra who was maybe 16 and quick, and together they put up more in the cellar by August than I'd managed the whole year before. I know because I'd been keeping the old inventory in a ledger, and she had started a new one, neater, cross-referenced. I looked at the two ledgers side by side one evening and felt something between embarrassment and relief. One evening in July I came in filthy, the kind of filthy that gets into your teeth, and there was hot water waiting in the washroom, which hadn't happened since Martha. Not by her arrangement, but by Cal's. He'd hauled it in from the stove without being told. I stood in the washroom with the steam rising off the basin, and I had to take a minute. Just a minute. My hands on the edge of the basin and the hot water in front of me and the quiet of the house around me. I didn't let myself think too much about what that meant, but I filed it. The cattle were doing better that summer than they had in 2 years. Partly it was the season, which was wet enough without being too wet. Partly it was that I was sleeping better, and the days that used to feel like something to get through had started feeling like something to do. Small difference, big effect. I had a conversation with Hector, my hand, in late June. We were out mending fence in the east pasture, and he said, out of nowhere, "You seem different." I said, "How's that?" He said, "Present." I didn't say anything to that. He went back to his post hole. After a while he said, "She's good." I said, "Yes." He said, "Not just that she cooks and keeps the books. Good." I said, "I know." He nodded, and we went back to the fence. There was an afternoon in early July when a storm came up fast from the northwest, the kind that turns the sky the color of a bruise in about 20 minutes. I was at the south end of the property with Hector, and we saw it coming, but we were too far out. I rode hard for the barn. By the time I got to the yard, the horses were already in, all 4 of them, stalled and fed, and the chickens were shut in, and the cellar door was propped. I stood in the yard for a second in the first wind of the thing and looked around. Adeline came to the kitchen doorway. She said, "Boys are inside, coffee's on." I said, "How'd you know?" She said, "I watched the sky all morning. It had that color." I got inside just before the hail started. Later, with the storm still going, Denny told me that she had taken him out to the porch at noon, while it was still clear, and showed him how the clouds were stacking in the northwest, a particular way they stacked when water was coming, she said. She showed him which way the wind was shifting and what it meant. She gave him things to look for. He repeated them to me that evening with the precision of a boy who has been given a key to something, going through each one on his fingers. I said, "Where'd you learn that?" He said, "Her." I said, "I mean, where did she learn it?" He thought about it. She said her father showed her when she was little. Cal said, from the other side of the room where he'd been pretending not to listen. She said he was restless but good at reading weather. I looked at him. He was looking at his book. Cal came around slower than Denny, like I said. What did it was not a gesture or a conversation but a fence line. We'd been replacing the east fence all through June. Cal riding with me because he was old enough to be useful, and because he'd asked to. And we'd been working together in that way you work with someone you're not talking to, just the task, the wire, the posts, the quiet rhythm of it. And on a Wednesday afternoon he lost hold of a wire, and it snapped back across his forearm and cut him good. Not deep enough for a doctor, but deep enough that it bled right through the rag I tied around it. And we rode back in, and Adeline took one look at his arm and said, "Kitchen. Now." He sat at the table, and she cleaned it and bound it, and she was quick, and she was sure, and she didn't make a fuss about it. Didn't coo at him or talk about how brave he was being. Just worked. She had water already hot. She had water hot more often than not, I'd noticed, always thinking a step ahead of what the day might need. When she was done, she tied the bandage and sat back and looked at it and said, "Change that in the morning. Don't let it sit." And then she went back to what she'd been doing. Cal looked at his arm for a moment. Then he looked at her retreating back. He didn't say anything that evening. But the next morning he came down early and stood in the kitchen doorway and watched her for a minute, and then he said, "Can I help with something?" She handed him the bucket and told him to get water from the well. He went and got it, and the morning after that, and the morning after that, until it was just a thing he did. I told her one night in August about Martha. Not the death. I'd already told her the shape of that in one of the letters. The life. I told her about how Martha had come out from Ohio as a young woman, 22, and had cried for the first 3 months because she'd had no idea what the frontier would actually look like, and then one morning had just stopped crying and gotten up and become the toughest woman I'd known in my life. I told her about the way Martha had a particular whistle she used for the boys that could carry half a mile, and how she could sit a horse in a dress better than most men in trousers, and how she'd read to the boys every night without fail, even when she was tired past tired. I hadn't talked about Martha to anyone, not in 2 years. The words came out rougher than I expected, like something that had dried and needed to be worked back into use. Adeline listened to all of it. She didn't look uncomfortable. She didn't redirect. She listened the way she did everything fully, without performance. When I was done, she said, "She sounds like someone worth grieving." I said she was. She said, "You're still grieving her." I said, "Less than I was." She said, "That's all right. I'm not asking you to be done." We were on the porch, the two of us, late enough that the stars were out thick. I'd brought a blanket out because it got cold fast up on the ridge once the sun went. She had it around her shoulders. I said, "Adeline." She looked at me. I said, "I want you to know that this has been that I didn't expect." I stopped, started again. "I'm a man who has trouble with certain sentences." She said, "I know." I said, "You're good at this." She said, "At what?" I said, "All of it, the boys, the house, the accounts, Harlan Webb." That last one made her smile just a little, being here. She said, "I'm not here because I had to be." I said, "I know." She said, "I stayed because I wanted to stay. You understand that? I could have made other arrangements, could have left in the first week, trunk or no trunk." A pause. "I stayed because this is the first place in a long time that felt like somewhere. And she stopped, looked out at the dark. "You're a good man, Gideon. You're a better man than you think you are." I saw that early. I looked out at the dark ridge. The cattle were settled. No sound from the barn except the occasional shift of something in the hay. She put her hand through my arm, not pressing, not asking, just there, her shoulder against mine, warm through the blanket. I sat with that, let it settle. After a while I said, "The boys are going to be fine." She said, "I know." I said, "You did that." She said, "We did that." The stars moved the way stars do, slow and without any particular interest in us, and the blanket was warm where it touched both of us, and I didn't need to say anything else. We sat on that porch until the moon came up over the south ridge, and then we went inside. September brought the drive, which took me away for 12 days. I'd always done it with just one hired hand before, a man named Hector who'd been with me 8 years. That year Cal asked if he could come. He was old enough, other boys his age had done it, and he'd earned it through the summer. I said yes. The morning we left, Adeline stood in the yard with Denny beside her. Denny was trying hard not to look like he was sorry to be left behind, because he'd made the decision himself. Someone had to stay and help his stepmother, was how he'd put it, which was Denny being 8 and trying to be a man about it. Cal rode up beside me on the bay mare I'd put him on for the summer. He sat it well. He'd learned fast. Adeline looked up at me. She said, "Bring him back whole." I said, "I will." She said, "And yourself." I said that too. She reached up and adjusted something on my coat, the collar which had folded in on itself, and smoothed it down. Quick, without ceremony. But her hand stayed on my chest for just a moment before she stepped back. I felt it through the coat. Cal was looking at his saddle horn. We rode out. The drive went fine. Hard work, cold nights, a river crossing on the 3rd day that was rougher than I'd expected and cost us 6 head, which hurt but didn't ruin us. Cal was steady through the whole thing. He didn't complain about the cold and he didn't flinch at the river, and when one of the steers got into trouble in the crossing, he went in after it without being told. Came up soaking and grinning. Hector said to me that night at the fire, "That boy's going to be something." I said, "He already is." I thought about them every night. All 3 of them. That was new. Before, the drive had been a relief, a clean stretch of work with nothing in it but the cattle and the miles. This time I was impatient to be done. On the 9th night I was sitting by the fire after Hector had turned in and Cal was asleep in his bedroll, and I was thinking about the way the house looked from the yard in the evening when all the lamps were lit, which it hadn't been, the whole time I was alone. The boys would go to bed, and I'd sit in the one lamp circle, and the rest of the house was dark. Now every window had light in it by the time the sun went down, because she moved through the rooms doing what needed doing, and she lit a lamp in each one. It was a small thing, but it was the thing I thought about. We came back on a Sunday afternoon, which I hadn't intended. I'd expected we'd make it to Monday, and rode into the yard to find Adeline and Denny in the kitchen garden, the 2 of them harvesting the last of the squash before the frost that was coming. Denny heard us first and came running across the yard. He grabbed Cal off the horse, which nearly knocked him down, and then he came and hit me in the leg about waist height and held on. I got down and put my hand on the back of his head. Adeline came across the yard. She had a squash under each arm and her hair was pulling loose from its pins, and there was garden dirt on her chin which she didn't know about. She looked at Cal first, a real look, checking him over without making it a production, and then she looked at me. She said, 12 days. I said, 12 days. She said, "You look like you haven't slept." I said, "I slept." She said, "Poorly." She handed Cal one of the squashes, which made him laugh. He'd expected something more ceremonial about coming back from his first drive, and she turned and walked back toward the house. I walked beside her. The sun was low and the yard was orange with it, the way it gets in September before the cold comes down for good. Denny was already grilling Cal about the river crossing. She said, quiet enough that just I could hear, "I'm glad you're back." I said, "So am I." She looked at me sideways, just a look, but it was a clear one. I said, "Adeline." She said, "Don't make a speech, Gideon." I said, "I wasn't." She said, "You were about to." She was right. I shut my mouth. She laughed. It was quiet just a little and she was looking ahead at the house, but it was there. The frost came that week, and then the snow, and we settled into winter. It's different winter when there's someone else in the house. Sounds different. Feels different. The lamp at the table in the evenings, the boys at their schoolwork, Adeline across from me with her mending or her letters or the accounts. Sometimes just the four of us in the same room doing our own things. That kind of quiet. Harlan Webb came out to the ranch in November, the first time he'd come out in the 3 years since Martha died. He said he had a proposition about the creekbed water rights, which I'd been dealing with him over for a year. He sat at my table and he was his usual self, working from a position of assumed advantage, talking slow, watching for the flinch. Adeline brought coffee and sat down. Webb looked at her, she looked back at him. He said, "I was speaking to Mr. Cade." She said, "And I'm Mr. Cade's wife, so you're speaking to both of us." She opened the ledger she'd brought in. "I've gone over the creek deed, Mr. Webb. Your easement expired in August of '81. What you've been drawing since then is ours." He went red. She laid the ledger open to the page. He looked at me, I looked at the page. He came around eventually, the way men like Webb come around when the numbers are clear. Adeline was not unkind about it. She was just factual. We settled it in an hour, which I hadn't been able to do in a year. When he left, he shook my hand and nodded at Adeline and went down the porch steps without a word. I watched him drive out of the yard. When I came back and I said, "You knew about the easement." She said, "Since September. I was waiting for him to come out." I looked at her. She said, "You'd have gone to him, on his ground. It's better when they come to you." I thought about that. The water rights issue had cost me 2 years of bad feeling with a neighbor, and she'd resolved it in an hour because she'd waited, which I wouldn't have done. I'd have gone to him in October, hat in hand, and argued and lost ground and come home sour. I said, "You could have told me." She said, "I'm telling you now." There was an incident in November that I heard about secondhand because I wasn't there. I'd gone over to the Garner property to settle a fence dispute. The first time I'd been on speaking terms with Garner in 2 years, and it had taken most of the day. When I came home, Adeline told me about it at supper, matter of fact, while the boys were in the other room. A man had come to the door mid-morning. She didn't know him, not from town, not from any of the neighboring spreads. He said he was looking for work. She said we weren't hiring. He said he'd come a long way and could she offer something to eat. She fed him on the porch, not inside. She brought him bread and cold meat and water, stood in the doorway while he ate and kept the door at her back. He asked a number of questions she described as not quite right: how many men on the property, whether my hired hand lived in, where the nearest neighbor was. She answered them in ways that gave nothing. When he was done eating, he said he'd be willing to work for what she'd given him, which was an odd thing to say after already being given it. And she told him we weren't hiring and thanked him for stopping and went inside and turned the latch. She said he sat on the porch step for a few minutes and then rode out. She said this all the same way she'd say anything steady, without drama. Then she went back to her plate. I said, "Did you take the rifle out?" She said, "It was on the table inside the door the whole time." I said, "Good." She said, "I know." The boys didn't know about any of it. She hadn't told them and I didn't either. But I thought about it that night, thought about her standing in the doorway of my house with the rifle inside at her back and her voice calm, feeding a stranger on the porch and giving nothing away, watching him ride out. I thought about it and felt something that took me a while to find the right word for. The word was trust, not just that I trusted her, that the house trusted her, that she was a person a house could trust. Christmas that year was the first real one since Martha. Adeline had started on it in November without saying anything, small things. A wreath she'd made from something she found in the hills. A cake she'd been soaking in brandy and cloth for weeks. Something she was stitching for the boys late at night when they were asleep. On Christmas morning, Cal came downstairs and found a pair of good work gloves on the table with his name on them. Proper gloves sized for a boy who was getting close to a man's hands. And he picked them up and held them and didn't say anything for a moment. Then he said, "These are good gloves." Adeline said, "I figured you'd ruin them by spring, but they'll see you through the winter." He put them on, they fit. Denny got a book, a real one, not a school book, about horses, with illustrations, which he turned to the first page of and then looked up at her and said, "Did you know what kind of horse I like?" She said, "Cal told me." Denny looked at Cal. Cal was inspecting the stitching on his gloves. Denny said, "You're not supposed to tell." Cal said she asked. After dinner that evening, the boys were in bed early, tired out from the day, and Adeline and I were at the table with the last of the coffee. The tree she and Denny had cut and brought in was in the corner with the candles they'd put on it, burned down now to stubs. The room smelled like pine and the cake she'd made and wood smoke. I said, "This is the best Christmas this house has had in a while." She said the boys enjoyed it. I said, "So did I." She looked at me. "Good," she said, "just that," and she picked up her cup. I watched her across the table, and I thought that this was the thing I hadn't known how to want, which was not the particular woman or the particular evening, but the specific fact of not being alone in it. The specific fact of there being someone else in the house who had made something of the day with you. The sound of it, and the smell, and the two boys asleep upstairs. I hadn't known how to want it because I'd had it and then I hadn't, and wanting it back had felt like something I didn't have the right to do. I saw that now. There was a night in February when the cold came down hard, the kind that cracks the timber and kills the unprepared cattle, and I was out past midnight checking the herd. When I came in, Adeline was up. She'd kept the stove going and there was hot coffee, and she didn't say anything about the hour. She just poured the cup and set it in front of me. I sat down and drank it and let the heat back into my hands. She sat across from me, same as that first night with the cold coffee and the lamp between us, except that everything was different now. A year of winter and thaw and summer and harvest and 12 days away and 12 days back and two boys who had their gloves and their book and their mother's recipe for molasses cookies kept safe in the tin box on the shelf. A year of the fixed latch and the reorganized pantry and the creek easement settled at my own kitchen table. A year of a lamp in every window. I looked at her across the table. She said, "Cattle all right." I said, "Lost one, just the one." She said, "Could have been worse." I said, "Could have been." She got up and took my cup and refilled it and set it back down. And then she put her hand on my shoulder, standing beside me, just her hand resting there, warm and certain. I put my hand over hers. We stayed like that for a minute. Outside, the wind was doing what it does in February, coming off the mountains with nothing to slow it down. Inside, the lamp was steady and the stove was going, and somewhere upstairs two boys were sleeping in the warmth that a year ago had not been there. She said, "Come to bed, Gideon." I got up. She took her hand off my shoulder and I caught it before it fell away, and I held it for a moment, just held it, the two of us standing there in the kitchen in the middle of the night in the middle of winter. Her hand was warm and calloused and capable, the hand of a woman who had built something out of what she'd been given, same as me. The hand that had fixed the chicken coop latch and bound Cal's arm and laid the ledger open to the right page and smoothed my collar flat the morning I rode out. I looked at her. She looked back, steady, no question in it, no performance, no softness that wasn't earned, just her, clear-eyed in the lamplight, willing to be here. And that right there was the thing that had been missing. Not the work managed or the accounts kept or even the warmth in the house. It was somebody who looked at you that way, who had seen the whole of it and was still standing in your kitchen at 1 in the morning holding your hand like it was the most natural thing, because it was. I let her hand go. She picked up the lamp and I followed her out of the kitchen and up the stairs, and the cold was outside and the house was quiet, and that was enough. That was exactly enough. I think about the trunk sometimes. The brown one, shoved back under the porch in the dark by two 8-year-old boys who were terrified of being left again. It's up in the attic now next to Martha's. Adeline put it there herself, sometime in the spring of that first year. Said she didn't need it accessible. Said she knew where it was if she needed it. I asked if she didn't want it in her room, and she said the attic was fine. I haven't thought about that trunk in years. Neither have the boys, I expect. Cal is past 12 now, doing a man's work, those gloves replaced twice and a third pair on order. Denny has read every page of the horse book and has opinions I didn't ask for about every animal on the property, some of which have turned out to be correct. He got the weather reading right last spring, called a storm 2 hours before it came in, which saved us a cutting of hay that would have gone to rot. The latch on the chicken coop is still holding. She put 2 good nails in it and they haven't budged. The lamp goes on in every room at dusk. That hasn't changed. Some mornings I come in from the barn and she's at the stove, and the boys are at the table, and the coffee is already poured, and I stand in the doorway for a second just to look at it. Not because I'm afraid it will be gone. I stopped being afraid of that somewhere in the second year. I look at it because it's worth looking at. A man in a good house, with work he knows how to do, and a woman who chose to be there. Not because she had to, not because she had nowhere else, but because she looked at the whole of it and said yes. The trunk is in the attic. She's not going anywhere. Neither am I.